This is Democracy Watch. All right, Mark, we've got some breaking news here. This was totally unexpected. So the House, led by Mike Johnson, has basically called the January 6th committee illegitimate. And this was after a 3-2 committee vote, obviously along partisan lines. So now that this is somehow the formal position of the United States House of Representatives, Republican leaders are using that to claim that all subpoenas issued by the January 6th committee then are just rendered invalid. And obviously, this can have major ripple effects here. For example, Steve Bannon was sent to prison, will be sent to prison on July 1st for ignoring a subpoena from the January 6th committee itself. So first off, is this retroactive decision binding? And what are the implications for someone like Steve Bannon or even Peter Navarro, whose contempt charges were predicated on subpoenas sent by the January 6th committee?
All right, this is totally shameful. I mean, you're right. It's breaking news. It is important news. It's not news that's being covered nearly enough. But it is absolutely shameful. The idea that they are going to somehow, in their minds, wipe away the work of the January 6th committee and give a free pass to Steve Bannon, who I think this is, by the way, aimed at, right? I mean, Navarro's sitting in a federal prison, right? Like he's not, I don't think, right. I don't think this...
If they wanted to do something to help Navarro, they're a day late and a dollar short. This is really where they're pulling the guns out to help Steve Bannon.
They're doing this to help Steve Bannon, and so no, it's not going to work. They don't get to retroactively unwind a subpoena. It was a valid subpoena at the time it was issued. It was enforced. There has been a criminal trial that has adjudicated it already a valid subpoena. So that has already been established as a matter of fact. And so they're not going to be able to do this. The implications of this for Steve Bannon and Peter Navarro are that they still get to go to prison. But what it does is it gives the right wing, the MAGA extremists, the Steve Bannons and their ilk, another grievance against the system. It just is done to create a smokescreen to somehow cast as illegitimate the lawful exercise of prosecutorial power in the United States. This is no different than calling the insurrectionists hostages, having them sing at rallies. It is a shameful display. If the speaker is listening to this, shame on you. History will remember you for this kind of disgrace.
Well, the House is submitting an amicus brief to the Supreme Court based on this new update. Is there anything to suggest how the Supreme Court might rule on this if they take up the question of Bannon's impending incarceration, which I believe is being appealed up to the Supreme Court anyway?
Okay, so let's first start with there is no rationale for the U.S. Supreme Court to review the criminal sentencing of Steve Bannon. I mean, this is hardly the stuff that Supreme Court cases are made of. The Supreme Court hears like 60 cases a term. They are about to go out on summer vacation. God bless them. I hope they, I can only imagine where some of them are having their vacations paid for by. But they're about to go on vacation. The idea that somehow the Supreme Court would take this case up shows how little confidence people like you and I have in the U.S. Supreme Court. Because in a normal Supreme Court, we wouldn't be talking about this being potentially something they would hear. Number one. Number two, no, it should not influence the Supreme Court. The House here, as you say, is submitting an amicus brief. That means friend of the court. They're not a party to this case. The amicus don't get to interject new legal issues into cases. They get to offer a perspective on the issues that have already been raised. But, as I said, it is a commentary on how far the Supreme Court has fallen that the House Republicans think the Supreme Court might take it up. You and I are doing an episode saying the Supreme Court, who knows whether they would take it up?
Well, I guess that does raise the question then, is it metaphysically possible that the Supreme Court could take up this issue? I know that they only have a couple of days left in terms of handing down decisions for this term's arguments, but is it possible that they could take this up?
Again, the Supreme Court is supposed to handle cases of grave national importance or that involve circuit splits, where different circuits have different opinions. They are there as the court of last resort to resolve the questions that only the Supreme Court can resolve. someone who is held in contempt without, minimizing contempt, someone who's held in contempt and sentenced to a few months in prison is not the stuff of U.S. Supreme Court cases. I mean, the Supreme Court doesn't even hear death penalty cases where, where the penalty
it's literally life or death.
Is literally life or death.
Yeah.
So there's no rationale by which they would take this up, number one. Number two, the House can't commandeer the Supreme Court to take this case up by amicus brief. So no, there is no rationale by which the Supreme Court should hear this case.
Well, in general, can you wipe away legal action taken as the result of a committee or a statute that was in effect at the time that it was handed down?
So it's a very interesting question, but it's not one that this case really presents. Because again, the trial court has already had a trial. A jury has already considered the facts and decided the case. And this may not be intuitive to people, but one of the elements that the government had to prove at trial was that there was a valid subpoena and that he did not comply with the subpoena. That has been conclusively determined as a question of fact by the jury. So that jury verdict is not reviewable. Like, you cannot review the conclusions of fact of a jury. So there is no question to be opened up about whether or not there was, in fact, a valid subpoena. It's an interesting question of what would have happened if the House did this prior to the trial beginning, and whether or not Steve Bannon could have introduced that before the jury to create a question of fact. But that's not currently available to Bannon.
Also, I would just note for folks watching right now, if you want to stay on top of any Supreme Court decisions that are handed down as we await the end of this term, which is only a few days away, please make sure to sign up for Democracy Docket. It's the free news outlet Marc founded to focus on everything voting in elections. I'll put the link right here on the screen and also in the post description of this video. It is an amazing resource that I use on a literal daily basis. Marc, what is to stop House Republicans, based on what they're doing here, from just retroactively trying to invalidate everything that doesn't redound to their political benefit? Like every investigation ever taken against any Republican, by just trying to kind of render moot or invalid all of those committees or subpoenas or whatever it is.
Or ethics conclusions.
Right. I mean, Matt Gaetz right now is under investigation by the House Ethics Committee, which is, by the way, led by Republicans.
Right. And so it would, if the House Republicans were able to do this, we would cease to have a functioning House, even within the parameters of what a functioning House is, because every time there was a change in power, the party that came into power would simply undo all of the committee hearings and findings of prior Congresses. So it would truly destroy, the democratic process in the House, which, after all, has been kind of Donald Trump's way, right? He forces or he compels Republicans to do things that actually destroy the institutions that they rely on. But it's not going to happen because it's not within the power of the House to do that. The House has votes. Those are final votes, and future Houses don't get to undo the reality. They don't get to rewrite history as if something never happened.
And yet that hasn't stopped these Republicans from trying. So how do you think history is going to view Speaker Mike Johnson and House Republican leaders for holding this secret vote to formally reject a committee that was created to investigate a violent attack on their own workplace that resulted in insurrectionists in the House chamber with the intent of forcibly preventing the peaceful transfer of power, which is to say nothing of their effort to assassinate the vice president, among other politicians?
I think House Republicans, Speaker Johnson first and foremost among them, are going to be on an unfortunately long list of people history will revile. They will have their names etched in the ledger alongside people who, were responsible for the South seceding in the Civil War. They will be etched in the history books along the people who were supporters and implementers of Jim Crow. They will be etched in history alongside the names of people who tried to convince Franklin Delano Roosevelt not to enter into the Second World War. They will be the villains of history, and they will have to live with that fact. And their children and their grandchildren will bear the burden of knowing that their forefathers and foremothers, when democracy needed them the most, they were on the other side. When there was a fight in this country between good and evil, their ancestors are on the side of evil. And Speaker Johnson will be a repeat player there. You know, there is no one more responsible for the January 6th insurrection who was an elected official other than Donald Trump than Speaker Johnson. Speaker Johnson organized the House Republicans to try to overturn the election results. Speaker Johnson organized the effort that eventually became the effort on the floor of the House to try to reject the certified election results. So, you know, my one ask is not how people will remember them in the future, but how the media and how Democrats and how people of good conscience think of them today. You know, I am oftentimes very disappointed that people, you know, Speaker Johnson will do one thing that is marginally responsible. And all of a sudden people want to laud him. He is not a good guy. He is one of the bad guys. And as we head towards November, people need to recognize that the Republicans in the House have done more to damage democracy than almost anyone other than Donald Trump. And as you think about the coming elections, whatever your agreements or disagreements with Joe Biden, whatever your agreements or disagreements with Senator Schumer or with Hakeem Jeffries, you need to set them aside for the good of the country. You need to make sure that you are going to vote for every Democrat running for House and Senate. You are going to enthusiastically vote for Joe Biden. You are going to recruit your friends, your family, your coworkers, your colleagues, your customers, your leaders in your communities to make sure that they are registered and that they are voting for Joe Biden and Democrats up and down the ticket. And I don't want to hear about anything else, because without a functioning democracy, whatever other issues you care about, whether it is climate, whether it is fair treatment of the poor, whether it's immigration, whether it is our foreign policy, without a functioning democracy and without President Biden leading a Democratic Congress, you will not achieve any of the other things that you aim to achieve.
Perfectly put. We'll leave it there. Again, for those who are watching right now who want to support the invaluable work that Marc is doing in the courts with his team, please make sure to sign up for Democracy Docket. I'll put the link right here on the screen and also in the post description of this video. I'm Brian Teller Cohen.
I'm Marc Elias.
This is Democracy Watch.